Paul's with a group of disciples. Luke is with him. They leave Ephesus. And here the Holy Spirit, through Luke's hand, says, "When we had parted from them and had set sail, we ran a straight course to Kos, and the next day to Rhodes, and from there to Patara. And having found a ship crossing over to Phoenicia, we went aboard and set sail. When we came in sight of Cyprus, leaving it on the left, we came sailing to Syria and landed at Tyre. For there the ship was to unload its cargo. After looking up to the disciples, we stayed there 7 days, and they kept telling Paul through the Spirit not to set foot in Jerusalem." So here's another group of people, as we just saw in the previous chapter, who are trying to persuade Paul from going back to Jerusalem because they know the persecution that awaits him there. "When our days there were ended, we left and started on our journey, while they all, with wives and children, escorted us until they were out of the city. After kneeling down on the beach and praying, we said farewell to one another. Then we went on board the ship, and they returned home again. When we had finished the voyage from Tyre, we arrived at Ptolemais, and after greeting the brethren, we stayed with them for a day. On the next day we left and came to Caesarea, and entering the house of Philip the evangelist, who was one of the 7, we stayed with him. Now this man had 4 virgin daughters who were prophetesses, and we were staying there for some days. As we were staying there for some days, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea, and coming to us, he took Paul's belt and bound his own feet and hands and said, 'This is what the Holy Spirit says. In this way, the Jews at Jerusalem will bind the man who owns this belt and deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles.' When we heard this, we, as well as the local residents, began begging him not to go up to Jerusalem." So there's a prophecy through this man, this prophet Agabus, that Paul is going to be bound by the Jews at Jerusalem and deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles. And even Luke begs him not to go at this point. He says, here we've had a prophecy from the Holy Spirit that this persecution, this deliverance to the Gentiles, this pain or difficult situation awaits you in Jerusalem, and please don't go. Even Luke joins in at this point. Then Paul answered, "What are you doing, weeping and breaking my heart? For I am not only ready to be bound, but even to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." And since he would not be persuaded, we fell silent, remarking, "The will of the Lord be done." Just to note Paul's, I assume part of it's bravery, but also just his love for God and his love for Jesus, and knowing that the whole reason that anyone wants to cause harm to him is not because he's an inflammatory person or he's mean or he's broken any actual laws. They just hate him because he's speaking out for Jesus. And his goal is to get back to Jerusalem. And he says, if they're going to harm me there, the whole reason I'm going back is for Jesus. And if they're there to harm me, let them kill me. I mean, I don't care about being harmed. I don't care about dying. I care about working for the Lord. And if working for the Lord brings about pain and brings about death, then so be it. And the rest of the crowd, even though they love Paul and they don't want bad things to happen to him, they still recognize that he's working for the Lord, and he is attempting to execute the will of the Lord, or to live by what the Lord wills. And they remark that, okay, well, the will of the Lord be done, and they stop trying to keep him from going back to Jerusalem. After these days, we got ready and started on our way to Jerusalem. Verse 16. Some of the disciples from Caesarea also came with us, taking us to Mnason of Cyprus, a disciple of long standing with whom we were to lodge. After we arrived in Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. And the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. After he had greeted them, he began to relate one by one the things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they began glorifying God, and they said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they are zealous. They are all zealous for the law. And they have been told about you, that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children nor to walk according to the customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Therefore do this that we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take them and purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads, and all will know that there is nothing to the things which they have been told about you, but that you yourself also walk orderly, keeping the law. But concerning the Gentiles who have believed, we wrote, having decided that they should abstain from meat sacrificed to idols, and from blood, from what is strangled, and from fornication. So here, Paul goes into the elders, and he's speaking about all the things that he did while he was out on his missionary journeys. And of those things that he did, he talked about what he took to the Gentiles. And the last time he was with this group of elders, they sent him out to accomplish a very specific goal. And what was when they got together as their council, the elders got together to talk about how they were going to go out and spread this message among the Jews and Gentiles. What was that conversation about?
Circumcision.
It was about circumcision. And it was about specific, not just circumcision, but as it related to what? I mean, that was
To the old law.
to the old law, exactly. And they were trying to send out this message that it's not about that. It's not about circumcision. It's not about these physical things that you have to uphold from the old law, but instead focus on these other things. And then when he comes back and he talks about all the good works that the Lord had done with the Gentiles, they then say, well, look, there have been a lot of people who believed since you've been gone, a lot of God-fearing former Jews who now believe, and they know about you, and they know about what you've been saying. So maybe we should just make sure they know that you've been out talking about the message we sent, and not necessarily about these other things. And then go purify yourself and make it look like you're a good little Jew like the rest of us, so you can go into the temple. And for what purpose? I mean, what's going on here?
Brother Franklin Camp, who's a great Bible student, tells the Jew that Paul simply made a mistake in what he did here. That he went contrary to his own teaching. However, it seems that another aspect that could be the Jerusalem conference in chapter 15 of that. The Jews who wanted to maintain custom that did not bind it on the others, was not a condition of salvation, were free to do so as Judaism was fading out. And that Paul was therefore at liberty as a Jew to do this. He doesn't do it because it's binding upon them, but simply to cause these brethren to be happier with him. So it's our choice, I guess, to decide whether Paul made a mistake or if he's simply doing what God permits.
Right.
I think those are all, of course, very good points. But I don't know that it's a question so much of whether Paul sinned in doing this as a Jew, but I think a case could be made that he erred in judgment as far as what he was trying to accomplish.
Right.
You know, what bothers me is when you look at his ministry, everywhere he went, even the things he wrote, he was one of the most uncompromising human beings you'll ever come across. He just flat out, I'm not going to go there because this is the way it's supposed to be, and I'm laying the case out for the gospel. I'm not going to flinch, I'm not going to back up. In this case, it's almost like he blinks. It's like, because maybe because everywhere he had been going up to this point, he had been warned, you're going to suffer, and the Jews are going to bind you and hand you over to Gentiles. He knew that. Maybe he had a lapse in judgment in the sense that he thought, I can avoid that if I just make these overtures to my Jewish brethren. I think it had something along those lines had to be going on. He's trying to minimize the opposition to himself. At least he can get his Jewish Christian brethren on his side, and that would help him to some extent. Maybe what he's thinking, but I don't know. In my opinion, and that's all it is an opinion, it seemed to me he erred in judgment, and probably because for a brief moment, however you want to look at it, rather than just relying on the truth of the gospel and what he had been preaching and his uncompromising stance, he he tried to take the matter into his own hands, and he wound up, hurting.
And this isn't his own idea. This isn't him saying, you know what, I think I'll go in and purify myself and pay these wages for these men to be able to shave their heads and go into the assembly with my other Jewish brethren. And this also isn't just an everyday group of advisors he has telling him. Who's advising him to do this? James and the other elders. And so the elders of the church are encouraging him to do this. It's likely a convincing argument or a convincing situation where he might have looked to other men who had similar guidance that he did, similar relationship with the Holy Spirit, the leadership role within the church. They're talking to him about needing to do this, and whether he felt as though he needed to do what they said, or that he saw what they were advising to do and saw it that, like you said, he would have an opportunity to have a greater impact with his Jewish brethren, or whatever it was. We see that he does it. He follows this advice that he's given by the elders here.
What's interesting to me, and this is kind of what's in the back of my mind as I'm trying to understand, as we all are, what happened here. If you go back to chapter 15, for example, he argued about circumcision vehemently. And there was no small dissension among them. And he wasn't backing up on the question. And if you read what he said in Galatians 2 about that very episode, even though the brethren were insisting that he go to Jerusalem to discuss it, he wasn't inclined to go until God told him to go. That just seemed to be his nature. It's like he knew he was right. He wasn't going to back up, wasn't going to let the brethren, the elders, anybody tell him to do otherwise until the Lord spoke up. Maybe that could have been, that whole incident might have been in the back of his mind here. He's like, well, I was wrong then. Maybe, who knows what he was thinking.
Right.
Clearly, his effort was to try to bridge the gap between him, the apparent gap between him and James and that kind of group in the church.
And it's not just a matter of going into this assembly and listening. It wasn't that he just went and heard something. It wasn't that it was participatory. I mean, we see that let's just read about it. We haven't got to that part yet. We'll start back at 23. Therefore do this that we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take them and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses that they may shave their heads, and all will know that there is nothing to the things which they have been told about you, that you yourself also walk orderly, keeping the law. Side note before we keep going. That's the part that bothers me the most. That they say, look, I know you've been out doing the work of the Lord and doing exactly what is the right thing to do, but we don't want to let people know exactly what you've been up to. If you go and you look and walk and act like a Jewish Christian, someone who still upholds the law, then they won't know that you have been sharing the gospel and working so hard with the Gentiles to spread the gospel. And it almost sounds as though those who were saying that, by doing so, by saying that Jesus is the Son of God, that was blasphemy toward God the Father in the old law. They didn't come out and say just that. They said, go do these things so that there's nothing to the things which they have been told about you. And the things that have been told about them is exactly what he's been. Actually, it's almost like covering up the truth to try and placate the people around them, to keep peace.
In any case, it didn't turn out well for him.
Right. Yeah, regardless.
If you look at what James said to him, he goes on to say, only that the Gentiles not keep the law, but as a Jew, we want the message to be heard that you, Paul, keep the law.
Right.
Paul knew better than that. He knew that it didn't matter if you're Jew or Gentile. It made no difference. We are one in Christ. He knew about the separation between himself and the law. However, you could argue too that it's more of a cultural thing. It's hard to distinguish in you're not opposed to Jews, kind of.
Right.
That's kind of part of the argument. But then again, there may be the idea that the Hebrew writer suggested, and Paul said in 2 Corinthians 3 about the law is fading away. It didn't just happen overnight. It wasn't that, as a Jew, in other words. Those Jews continued to observe that law, at least as long as the temple was standing. They continued to go. I mean, even Peter went into the temple at the hour of prayer. That's when he healed the man. I mean, they were still doing those things.
Yeah.
Hebrew says the law is vanishing.
Yeah.
In the process, vanishing away.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about, the old covenant, is vanishing away. That's the last verse of chapter 4.
That's the book of Hebrews, written
Right.
to Hebrew Christians.
In Romans 7, he said, am I saying the law is bad? No, the law is great. It's our failure to keep it right as Jews that causes the problem. It's our sinful nature that was so much opposed to the law. The law itself is, so he always wanted to say the law itself per se, if God gave it, is not bad. Same as that was true in the book of Romans. The law was good once it was given, but the Jews would not keep it.
Right.
So this is one of the most puzzling things in the book of Acts to understand why Paul did it.
But he's paying for sacrifices.
That's where we were headed to.
He's paying for sacrifices. He's not. This is every aspect of the law of Moses that he knew better than, I'm just saying, it just seems to me, as a 21st century Gentile, it's easy for us to look at them. You have to understand the struggle they were going through, and I appreciate that, but just knowing what we know about Paul, it just seems so out of character for him to do this. I mean,
Right. In verse 26, going to the sacrifice piece. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself along with them, went to the temple, giving notice of the completion of the days of purification, until the sacrifice was offered for each one of them. The need for sacrifice was over with, and Paul had been preaching that for some time, and knew that there was no point to this animal sacrifice that was being offered on his behalf, yet still participated in it. And that's when you look at what's so odd about this situation. It's where the elders are trying to cover up the things that he's been saying and doing, and at the same time that Paul is allowing even a sacrifice to be made on his behalf when he knows there's no purpose in it.
In verse 25, it goes immediately to the Gentiles. Luke does, who's the recording here, explaining this doesn't pertain to Gentiles in any sense. Seems to be saying there's liberty for Jewish Christians if they choose to engage in aspects of the law, so long as it doesn't bind it upon
Right.
Christians. I think that's the best way to explain what he's done.
Right.
So it goes immediately to Acts 15, in verse 25, what happened to the Jerusalem conference. We learned that this doesn't pertain to Gentiles at all, but it seems to be saying that it's permissible temporarily for Jews.
Yeah.
I think that's a better explanation.
Right. Chris?
When I think about this, I always think back to what he writes in 1 Corinthians 9. And I had to look it up.
became all things all men.
Yeah, and like you look at the whole thing, verse 19, for though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all that I might win more. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not making myself under the law. And he goes on, and to those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. So he understood that this didn't necessarily mean anything or require anything, but he was trying to win them. He was trying to influence them, and whether he should have done it or shouldn't have done it in this situation, I think knowing Paul, knowing who he was, knowing probably why he did it, it's hard to fault at least his motives
Right.
and why he did it.
And like Patrick said, it didn't turn out well for him either way. Verse 27, when the 7 days were almost over, the Jews from Asia, upon seeing him in the temple, began to stir up all the crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, come to our aid. This is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people and the law and this place. And besides, he has even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. They had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with him, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Then all the city was provoked, and the people rushed together. And taking hold of Paul, they dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. While they were seeking to kill him, a report came up to the commander of the Roman cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. At once he took along some soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander came up and took hold of him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains, and he began asking who he was and what he had done. But among the crowd some were shouting one thing and some another, and when he could not find out the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks. When he got to the stairs, he was carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob, for the multitude of the people kept following him, shouting, "Away with him!" As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I say something to you?" And he said, "Do you know Greek? Then you are not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness?" But Paul said, "I am a Jew of Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no insignificant city, and I beg you, allow me to speak to the people." So here, the commander has no idea who he is. He just knows that there's been a riot. He assumes that maybe he's someone like this Egyptian who stirred up all these people, and likely that would have been the fear that here was someone who was trying to stir something up in the city, and this commander is responsible for keeping peace in the city, and he's a Roman commander, so he would have been charged to keep peace on behalf of Rome. And he's just trying to do his job. Then he finds out, he says, here's this Jew of Tarsus. Paul does not yet tell what insignificant city he's a citizen of. He just says he's a citizen of one. And he just asks to speak to the people. And obviously here the commander thinks that that's innocent enough. He's been beaten. He's had this kind of riot around him, and he's not going to try and incite them, at least based on the knowledge that he had, so he allows them to speak to the people. And Paul, standing on the stairs, motioned to the people with his hand, and when there was a great hush, he spoke to them in the Hebrew dialect, saying, "Brethren and fathers, hear my defense, which I now offer to you." And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew dialect, they became even more quiet. And he said, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated under Gamaliel, strictly according to the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, just as you all are today. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and putting both men and women into prisons, as also the high priest and all the council of the elders can testify. From them I also received letters to the brethren, and started off for Damascus in order to bring even those who were there to Jerusalem as prisoners to be punished. But it happened that as I was on my way, approaching Damascus, about noontime, a very bright light suddenly flashed from heaven all around me. And I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' And I answered, 'Who are you, Lord?' And he said to me, 'I am Jesus the Nazarene, whom you are persecuting.' And those who were with me saw the light, to be sure, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, 'What shall I do, Lord?' And the Lord said to me, 'Get up and go into Damascus, and there you'll be told all that has been appointed for you to do.' But since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, I was led by the hand of those who were with me and came into Damascus. A certain Ananias, a man who was devout by the standard of the law and well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there, came to me, standing near me, said, 'Brother Saul, receive your sight.' And at that very time I looked up at him, and he said, 'The God of our fathers has appointed you to know his will, and to see the righteous one, and to hear an utterance from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to all men of what you have seen and heard. Now why do you delay? Get up and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on his name.' It happened when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple that I fell into a trance. And I saw him saying to me, 'Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me.' And I said, 'Lord, they themselves understand that in one synagogue after another I used to imprison and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of your witness Stephen was being shed, I was also standing by approving, and watching out for the coats of those who were slaying him. And he said to me, 'Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles.' They listened to him up until this statement, and then they raised their voices and said, 'Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live.'" They probably liked the first part of his his defense here. He talks about how, look, I'm one of you. I was raised in the same schools you were. I was devout to the point of killing Christians. I approved of the death of Stephen. I was imprisoning both men and women who were claiming the way, who were claiming to be Christians. And whenever I went out to do this work outside of Jerusalem, and they listened to this part. They listened to the part where he said, I saw Jesus. I saw that he gave me commandments. I followed his commandments. I went in. I was baptized. And still they listened. And it wasn't until the point where he said that he was going out to the Gentiles that they stopped listening. And this is the very point of contention that James and the other elders warned him about, that he had been out doing, that his Jewish brethren would not listen to. And so whether it was those other Jews in the area who were listening to him give this defense, they said that he shouldn't even be allowed to live for going out and doing what he did. And as they were crying out and throwing off their cloaks and tossing dust into the air, the commander ordered him to be brought back into the barracks, stating that he should be examined by scourging so that he might find out the reason why they were shouting against him that way. So here the commander's listening to what he has to say, and he didn't quite understand what the deal was when he brought him back into the barracks the first time. He was just going to bring him in out of the riotous atmosphere to protect him, to keep worse things from going on in this area where he's responsible for guarding, keeping peace. And he allows him to give a defense, and he listens to what he says, and then everyone gets started up again, and he hears it, but still doesn't understand what the big deal is. And so he says, there must be something else. If we scourge him, then perhaps he'll confess to whatever it is that really is the problem. But when they stretched him out with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, and this is where he's waited to play his card the whole time, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned? So the uncondemned part, he's not been tried by a court. He's not been tried in front of a Roman court. He is an uncondemned man, even though people around him want to kill him, want to hurt him. And although he has been brought to this situation where he's about to be scourged, Paul says, look, I'm Roman, and I have not been tried for anything, and is it lawful for you to scourge me? When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and told him, saying, what are you about to do? For this man is a Roman. The commander came and said to him, tell me, are you a Roman? And he said, yes. The commander answered, I acquired the citizenship with a large sum of money. And Paul said, but I was actually born a citizen, which held more power, more clout, I guess. Therefore, those who were about to examine him immediately let go of him. And the commander also was afraid when he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had put him in chains. So not only was it not lawful for him to scourge him, it wasn't even lawful to put him in chains as a Roman citizen, especially when there had not been a reason. There was no real reason for him to have been put in chains in the first place. And he's afraid for it. And Paul knew that he had to wait to play this card at the right time. And knowing the danger that awaited him in Jerusalem, knowing that he was not going to be able to return to see some of his friends that he left behind in the various cities where he had evangelized, he knew that this was the time that he had to let people know that he was a Roman citizen. We know that his goal is to eventually get to Rome in order to share the gospel. It's probably not the way that he imagined it would happen, but we're about to see his path there. Any comments before we keep going on? All right, verse 30. But on the next day, wishing to know for certain why he had been accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the council to assemble, and brought Paul down and set him before him. So he allows Paul out of his chains, but still he wonders what the big deal is. So he brings together the people who he believes will be able to shed light on the situation. Chapter 23. Paul, looking intently at the council, said, "Brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day." The high priest, Ananias, commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck?" So he calls him a hypocrite. But the bystander said, "Do you revile God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I was not aware, brethren, that he was a high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." So he even says, in this moment, he's still trying to keep the law. He says, I was not trying to speak ill of God's high priest, but at the same time, the high priest didn't do what he was supposed to be doing. But perceiving that one group were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, "Brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I'm on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead." As he said this, there occurred a dissension between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. So he saw an opportunity and he took it. He sees that there are both Sadducees and Pharisees in the audience there, and all of the attention is on him in that moment. And one of the points of contention between Pharisees and Sadducees is whether or not there is a resurrection. And so Paul cries out that he is a Pharisee, and the whole reason that he's in this situation is because of the resurrection of the dead. I mean, if Jesus was resurrected, if Jesus came back from the dead, then that really is one of the reasons why he's there, because he's been preaching that resurrection.
Just a quick question for everybody to think about it. If the man that commanded Paul to be slapped on the mouth had not been the high priest, would it have been, as a Christian man about to be persecuted for the faith, would it be okay for him to call this individual a whitewashed wall and respond that way? It's interesting to me because when you think about what Paul is doing throughout this whole scenario, he first of all appealed to his Roman citizenship to get himself out of trouble. And now he's taking a personal affront and he's throwing it right back at the guy. And when you think about how those early Christians suffered, they were slapped in the mouth, they were beaten, they were stoned to death. I mean, died in horrible ways. How did they die? Did they go out meekly? Well, yeah, I suppose they did, but does that mean that they couldn't speak up for themselves? They couldn't say something? Like, this isn't right, what you're doing isn't right. It's just interesting when you look at what Paul is doing here. I mean, nobody wants to be slapped on the mouth, especially when they've done anything wrong and you're just making your defense. And haul up and slap you, but he turned right around and said, "God's going to slap you, you whitewashed wall." And he found out, he's a chief priest. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't know he was a chief priest. I'm not supposed to talk about him that way.
Right.
Had he not been the chief priest, as a Christian man, would it have been okay for Paul to do that? I mean, that's interesting, isn't it?
The name calling is one thing, and it's not that it was not a terrible insult to me, but I guess contextually,
A whitewashed wall,
yeah,
what does that mean?
I don't know. I mean, I'm sure we could analyze it and
I
come
think
up with
no, I think
something.
you're just a hypocrite.
Well, that's what he's
You appear to
calling
be
him
one
here.
thing, but you're something else.
They're there to judge him against the law, and he knows that. He at least knows that they're part of the council. He doesn't know that he's the chief priest or the high priest, obviously, but he knows that they are Jewish leaders, and yet he orders them to be struck, and that's in violation of the law. And so we know that that's the point of.
That's the whole issue.
That's the whole issue. I mean, it shows, number one, that he's knowledgeable of the law, but also that he's, if they're there to accuse him of breaking the law, they themselves are not upholding the law.
John the Baptist used strong language. Generation of snake, he called his audience.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus said again in his sermon, "You compass land and sea to make one proselyte, and when he's made, he's twofold more the child of hell than you are. You hypocrites, you whited wall." So Jesus used similar language.
Mm-hmm. Be interested why that's such a bad insult, but another study for another time. Verse 8. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. And there occurred a great uproar, and some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and began to argue heatedly, saying, "We find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him." So all of a sudden they have this camaraderie with him, because now they see it as an argument to defend their own faith, and it doesn't matter what he was brought there for or what other dissension he had caused among them. They saw him as a brother. And as a great dissension was developing, the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. But on the night immediately following, the Lord stood at his side and said, "Take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness at Rome also." So where he thought his journey was going to end at Jerusalem, and he had not had any indication that it was going to be Jerusalem specifically, he just knew he was never going to make his way back to those areas, and he knew he was going back to Jerusalem. Now he has this assurance from the Lord that his journey is not going to end at Jerusalem. He's not going to be murdered at Jerusalem. He will have an opportunity to witness, to tell of Jesus in Rome as well. Verse 12, when it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who formed this plot. They came to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a solemn oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. Now therefore you and the council notify the commander to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case by a more thorough investigation. And we, for our part, are ready to slay him before he comes near the place." But the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, and he came and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, "Lead this young man to the commander, for he has something to report to him." So he took him and led him to the commander and said, "Paul the prisoner called me to him and asked me to lead this young man to you, since he has something to tell you." The commander took him by the hand and, stepping aside, began to inquire of him privately, "What is it that you have to report to me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow to the council, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more thoroughly about him. So do not listen to them, for more than 40 of them are lying in wait for him who have bound themselves under a curse, not to eat or drink until they slay him. And now they are ready and waiting for the promise from you." So the commander let the young man go, instructing him, "Tell no one that you have notified me of these things." And he called to him 2 of the centurions and said, "Get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen." This is just like one little Jewish man. And there are 40 Jews out to kill him. And it shows the respect this commander has for a Roman citizen. This is a citizen of Rome, of which this commander has sworn to protect. He paid a large sum of money even to become a citizen himself, and his job is to keep peace in the area, but to protect Romans as well. And he knows that 40 people are lying in wait to kill this one Roman citizen, and so he gets 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen, and they were also to provide mounts to put Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor. It would have been such an overwhelming presence to see this many people guarding this person, that 40 people who had a death wish of should they not eat or drink until they were able to kill Paul. If they weren't able to kill him, I guess they were prepared to starve to death or to thirst to death. Or should they encounter other people who might try to protect him, they're going to have to make a decision. Do they give up on their oath, or do they themselves go to death? Verse 26. Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. When this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. And wanting to ascertain, that's kind of how it happened. He's telling the story he wants to tell. And wanting to ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. And I found him to be accused over their questions about their law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. When I was informed that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to bring charges against him before you. So the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. But the next day, leaving the horsemen to go on with them, they returned to the barracks. When these had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. When he had read it, he asked from what province he was, and when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing after your accusers arrive also, giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. That's kind of perfect timing. It wasn't just that the commander sent him out to Felix or out to another area in order to protect him. He kind of passed the buck. He said, I'm not going to deal with this anymore. I'm only a military man. I cannot hold court to have a trial for this man. And so he sends to Paul as well as a letter to the governor saying, this is for you to deal with. And not only am I sending you Paul, but his accusers will shortly follow, and you'll be able to hear them out, hear Paul out, and have a proper trial. And we'll pick up there next week. Thank you.